Hello learners, welcome to the PG Diploma in Environmental and Occupational Health program, the course MEV 001. We have taken the first block, Environment and Ecology, wherein second unit, that is ecosystems, is being discussed. We have talked about biogeochemical cycles in another session, and today we are going to take its part 2. So, the outline of today's session is that we would very briefly recall what was done in the previous session. We talked about ecosystem, hydrologic and carbon cycle. Then in this particular session, we are going to talk about the oxygen cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle and the sulfur cycle. Let's recall what was done in our previous session. We talked about ecosystem. Ecosystem is the interaction of biotic and non-biotic factors with the environment, and the important aspects of ecosystem are energy flow and the nutrient cycles. Then biogeochemical cycles fall into its ambit, which is the movement of nutrients etc. between biotic and abiotic factors. We talked about hydrologic cycle, which is water cycle, an important cycle, deals with evaporation, transpiration, interception, precipitation, runoff and infiltration. Then we have talked about carbon cycle, which is the movement of carbon through the reservoirs. So today, in this session, we would start with oxygen cycle. Oxygen, of course, is prime to everyone, and in this oxygen cycle, the movement and maintenance of oxygen through the 4 main regions or spheres of Earth takes place. The 4 regions we talked in our previous session also. Atmosphere, region which is above the Earth's surface, comprises of all kinds of gases. Biosphere is all the ecosystem on Earth, which will have biotic as well as the abiotic factors. Then we have lithosphere, which is Earth's crust and the largest reservoir. Hydrosphere is obviously, it deals with water and the water bodies and the systems. There are 3 stages of oxygen cycle. So in the first stage, photosynthesis by green plants releases oxygen into the atmosphere as byproduct. We know that photosynthesis is the process of consumption of carbon dioxide and release of oxygen. So this is stage 1. In stage 2, aerobic organisms use free oxygen for respiration. So the oxygen which is liberated is being used by all organisms which are using it for its respiration. Then in the third stage, we have animals and human beings which exhale carbon dioxide into the atmosphere after, of course, using the oxygen used by plants during photosynthesis, again to release oxygen. That is how the oxygen is replenished back into the ecosystem. So this is the oxygen cycle. And oxygen in air mixes with water into different water bodies and makes aquatic life alive. So oxygen not only exists in our atmosphere, but it is available in the water bodies also, where it is in the form of dissolved oxygen and responsible for the sustenance of all the aquatic plants. Then we come to one of the most important cycles, biogeochemical cycle, that is nitrogen cycle. Like oxygen or carbon or any other element, nitrogen is also very, very essential for all the living systems. And this is the element which is most abundant in this planet, and free nitrogen makes up around 80% of the Earth's atmosphere. And it is very essential to all the living organisms because it helps in the constitution of proteins, nucleic acids, chlorophyll, all kinds of biomolecules. And the only problem is it cannot be used in the free state because it is inert. And why it is inert is because of its stability. So, nitrogen needs to be converted to a usable form, and which is done by a number of transformations of the free nitrogen to first ammonia and then of course to other oxides. Let us see how it is done. First of all, we see that how does it exist in the atmosphere? It exists atmosphere or otherwise in the whole ecosystem. It exists in many different forms, including both inorganic like ammonia, nitrate and organic, for example amino acids, nucleic acids, and undergoes many transformations in the ecosystem, changing from one form to the other. This is achieved by a number of cyclic processes, as we have seen in hydrologic and carbon, and we will see in most of these cycles how it happens. So, what are the important steps here? Nitrogen fixation, nitrification, denitrification, NMOX, and assimilation, and the ammonification. The stages involved in the nitrogen cycle are as said earlier, fixation, nitrification, denitrification, NMOX, assimilation and ammonification. It is depicted in this particular diagram also. These reactions, when we come to these stages, we will talk about these reactions too. So, what is nitrogen fixation? Nitrogen fixation is the first step in the nitrogen cycle. It is the process of conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into biologically usable forms, and there are 4 types of nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen gets fixed by atmospheric, biological, industrial and combustion. The atmospheric fixation starts from the heat generated due to lightning. It makes the atmospheric nitrogen react with oxygen and moisture to form nitrogen oxides. So, the oxides return to the earth as rain and form nitrates reaching the ground. Nitrates are used by the plants to form compounds in those biomolecules which were mentioned earlier, and this is how the atmospheric fixation can be depicted. It starts with lightning, which breaks the nitrogen, that bond between nitrogen and in the nitrogen molecule, wherein nitrogen combines with oxygen and nitrogen oxides are formed. Nitrogen oxides dissolve in rain and change to nitrates, which are consumed finally by the plants, and then the whole food chain and the food web starts. Biological fixation was discovered by generic in 1901, and it is carried by special group of prokaryotes and also by symbiotic bacteria known as diazotrophs, Azobacter and Rhizobium. Also, the cyanobacteria fix significant amount of nitrogen in the oceans, lakes and soils. So, all these processes, these take place in the presence of enzymes. Nitrogenase enzyme catalyzes the reaction of gaseous nitrogen with hydrogen to form ammonia. So, this is how the prokaryotes in the nitrogen cycle can be depicted, wherein these are helpful in carrying out the reaction of conversion of nitrogen to ammonia by combination with hydrogen. Then industrial fixation is basically related to Haber-Bosch process, which is generally done at the industrial scale, where nitrogen combines with hydrogen at very high temperature and pressure to form ammonia. And this is the process of formation of formation of fertilizers, which is one of the very important component for the agriculturists, and the process is used for world's hybrid crops, but it uses fossil fuels for energy. After all, for this high temperature and pressure to sustain, one has to use some fuels, and fossil fuels are used for this. This results to carbon dioxide emissions and causes a lot of pollution, which has a lot of adverse effect on human health. So, during combustion of fossil fuels, nitrogen from coal is oxidized to nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere. and it gets converted to nitric acid and reaches the earth as acid precipitation. So, because it forms, nitric acid is one of the concentrated acids only, and along with sulfur dioxide, these are responsible for acid rains. Increased level of these increased levels of nitrogen containing compounds in the atmosphere and contribute to the greenhouse effect also. So, this is another process leading to global warming. Nitrogen nitrification. It is the process that converts ammonia to nitrite and then to nitrate. It occurs aerobically, that is in presence of oxygen, and is carried out exclusively by prokaryotes. It involves two distinct steps carried out by the distinct microorganisms. The first step is oxidation of ammonia to nitrite, as you can see in this reaction also. So, the microbes which are involved here are called as ammonia oxidizers, because they will convert ammonia to hydroxylamine first. It is the intermediate, and in presence of ammonia oxidase, it is formed, and then this hydroxylamine in presence of water, it gets hydroxylated, and in presence of oxidoreductases, it gives the nitrite. So, after this, in the second step, oxidation of nitrite to nitrate takes place. This step is carried out by a separate group of prokaryotes, which are nitrite oxidizing bacteria. They convert nitrite to nitrate as per this particular reaction. Both the steps give out very low energy, so the plant growth is also very, very low. So, the process of nitrogen NMOX is related, so what we saw in nitrification was oxidation in presence of oxygen. NMOX is anaerobic ammonium oxidation. It occurs anaerobically in absence of oxygen and carried out exclusively by a type of prokaryotes. These are Planctomycetes, belong to Planctomycetes phylum of bacteria. Bacteria oxidize ammonia using nitrite as electron acceptor to gaseous nitrogen. And finally, nitrogen denitrification. It converts nitrates to nitrogen gas, thus removes the bioavailable nitrogen and return it to the atmosphere and completes the cycle. Dinitrogen gas is the ultimate end product of denitrification. As per this reaction, nitrates getting converted to nitrite and then to nitrogen, and this is the nitrite which is getting nitrite, and the nitrate overall equation is given, which is forming nitrogen going back to the atmosphere, and this is how it can be depicted. So, these are the denitrification and the nitrification and denitrification reactions by which the nitrogen cycle gets completed. In the process of this nitrogen cycle, other intermediates like gaseous forms of nitrogen are also formed. Some of the gases like nitrous oxide are considered greenhouse gases, and these are responsible again for the global warming. These react with ozone and cause a lot of air pollution. How is denitrification related to the other processes? Nitrification is aerobic and denitrification is anaerobic process occurring mostly in soils and sediments and anoxic zones in lakes and oceans. So, one is without oxygen and the other one is in the presence of oxygen. Similar to nitrogen fixation, denitrification is carried out by prokaryotes, that is common to all of these. Some eukaryotes are also capable of carrying denitrification. So, what is the impact of denitrification? It removes the fixed nitrogen, that is nitrate, from the ecosystem and returns it to the atmosphere in the inert form, that is nitrogen molecule and gas. The loss of nitrates in fertilizer is detrimental and costly in agriculture, because it's again a cyclic process, because when you need more fertilizer, you will have to again do that process of by that Haber process, you will have to convert it into the fertilizers and use it for the plants, and on the contrary these are getting replenished also by a process of denitrification. And in wastewater treatment, however, it removes unwanted nitrates and saves from algal blooms. That is because if more of nitrates are there, then there will be a lot of algae which will cause a lot of eutrophication problems and a lot of toxicity in the water bodies. So that way denitrification is useful also, that it is removing nitrates and thus preventing the algal bloom. Ammonification is the conversion of organic nitrogen into ammonia by some fungi and prokaryotes. The source of organic nitrogen, that is amino acids or in turn the proteins and nucleic acids, that is DNA and RNA, is the excreta of the organisms or their dead body. The ammonia becomes available for uptake by plants and other microorganisms for growth. So ammonification that way, I mean, it's again useful for plants, that it is converting the organic nitrogen which was otherwise in the living system in the form of important biomolecules, and after they die or they decompose and are being used by the plants. Nitrogen assimilation. See, nitrates, nitrites and ammonia in the soil are absorbed by the plants and converted into nitrogenous organic compounds. And nitrates are converted to nitrites, then ammonia. Ammonia reacts with organic acids to form amino acids. So this is how the nitrogen assimilation takes place in the ecosystem, and how it is being consumed or how it is being used by the living beings in the formation of those important biomolecules. The amino acids are used in the synthesis of proteins, enzymes, chlorophylls, nucleic acids, etc. And animals derive their nitrogen requirement from the plant proteins, thus enters the consumers through the food chains. Indirectly it will come to the consumers because they would consume the plants, or the secondary consumers will then consume the primary consumers. In this process, energy is transferred in the form of protein and returns to the soil when they die. So this is how we can depict nitrogen cycle. You can see the atmospheric nitrogen which is getting fixed, and then nitrification, and by the process of denitrification going back to the atmosphere. This is how the whole cyclic process of nitrogen cycle takes place. Now come to phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is also one of the very important elements because for all living beings, because it is also key part of nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, which are, I mean, DNA, you know, is the genetic material, and the cell membranes. Most importantly, we are all composed of cells, and phospholipids are very important components of the cell membranes. So humans otherwise contain 80% of phosphorus in teeth and bones also. The only thing is, unlike other compounds, phosphorus cannot exist in the gaseous state because phosphorus is liquid at normal temperature and pressures. Therefore, nothing is available in the atmosphere, and all is present in the form of rocks and otherwise. Phosphorus is present in different forms like soil, rock and sediments on the earth as phosphate ion. This phosphate reaches the earth by the process of weathering of rocks. Phosphorus and phosphorus containing compounds are present only on land, as said, and so the atmosphere plays no significant role in the whole process of phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus cycle is the movement of phosphorus through the lithosphere, hydrosphere and biosphere, also called as the mineral cycle. So here you can see there is no atmosphere. Involves these steps like weathering, absorption by plants, absorption by animals, and then of course finally returning to the environment through decomposition. So weathering, in weathering, phosphorus is found in the rocks in abundance, and that is why the phosphorus cycle starts in the earth's crust. The phosphate salts are broken down from the rocks. These salts are washed away into the ground where they mix in the soil. The phosphate salts dissolved in water are absorbed by the plants. However, the amount of phosphorus present in the soil is very less. That is why the farmers apply phosphate fertilizers on agricultural land. Similar to nitrogen, you know that NPK are the important components in any types of fertilizers. So, phosphorus absorption by aquatic plants. The aquatic plants absorb inorganic phosphorus from lower layers of water bodies. The phosphate salts do not dissolve in water properly. Therefore, these affect the plant growth in aquatic ecosystems. Absorption by animals. The animals absorb phosphorus from the plants to which they are consuming, or by consuming the plant eating animals. These do not have any other source. They cannot directly absorb that phosphate or the phosphorus which is being formed as a result of weathering or which is available in the water. The rate of the phosphorus cycle is faster in plants and animals as compared to rocks. So, decomposition, finally the animals absorb phosphorus from the plants or by consuming plant eating animals. These return the return of phosphorus back to the ecosystem, that is how it comes back, by the means of decomposition, and thus phosphorus recycles through water, soil and sediments only. This is how phosphorus cycle can be depicted. So, by as you can see, by weathering it's coming to the water, it's being it's getting sedimentated there and coming to soil, being consumed by plants, and plants are being consumed by animals, and so on and so forth, and finally consumed by all living beings. When these decompose, it again comes back to the to the ecosystem, it comes back. That is how the cycle gets completed. This is another way of depicting it. The human impact on phosphorus cycle. During the shipping of food from farms to cities, phosphorus gets washed away in water. This leads to the growth of algae and ultimately eutrophication. So, because with this, the phosphorus is also very important for those green, these algae also to grow. Once it comes into water, there is algal bloom, which we saw, saw in the case of nitrogen also, how it was leading to, or how was denitrification helpful in the removal of this algal bloom. But phosphorus, when coming to water, it is causing algal bloom and finally eutrophication. This causes a toxicity in the aquatic ecosystem, and the phosphorus fertilizers increase the level of phosphorus also in the soil. Overuse of phosphorus fertilizers reduces the fertility of the soil and is also harmful to the microorganisms present in the soil, and that is how it impacts the whole ecosystem. The human impact of phosphorus is shown by this. So, sulfur cycle. Sulfur occurs in gaseous form as H2S and SO2, and in the solid form as sulfate, sulfide and organic sulfur in soil and in the body of living organisms. All of us are aware of sulfur dioxide, when present in the atmosphere, is one of the main reasons of the acid rain, and of course then deterioration of materials and otherwise. The residence time in the atmosphere is very small, and its main reserve pool is again soil, like the case of phosphorus. And sulfur is also present in proteins, amino acids, vitamins and enzymes, and necessary for plants and animals. The sulfur cycle, sulfur is transferred into biosphere, then back into ground, or from ground to atmosphere, and consists of two processes. It has atmospheric as well as terrestrial or the sedimentary process. So, the atmospheric process, in the atmospheric process, sulfur enters the atmosphere from several sources like the combustion of fossil fuels, then volcanic eruption, exchange at the surface of the oceans, and gases released by decomposition. In the terrestrial process, the cycle begins with the weathering of rocks that release stored sulfur. Sulfur then is converted into sulfate through oxidation, or sulfate is taken up by green plants and microorganisms and is converted into organic forms. The heterotrophs consume organic forms through their food, and in the oceans, sulfur enters the ocean through fallout from the Earth's atmosphere and terrestrial processes. In the ocean, some marine communities use sulfur in their metabolism. A part of this sulfur is emitted back into the atmosphere through sea spray also. The remaining sulfur is lost to ocean depths, forming ferrous sulfide that is responsible for the black color of most marine sediments. Must have noticed that. So, the sulfur cycle can be depicted like this, and how it is basically most of it in the soil, I mean the terrestrial state it is, and how it goes to on oxidation forms sulfur dioxide and other oxides, come back also in the form of acid rain, which is actually polluting the whole atmosphere. So, let us summarize what all is done in this particular session. We talked about the oxygen cycle, that is the movement of oxygen through the main regions of Earth, how oxygen is so important because all the living beings use it for respiration and release carbon dioxide, which is being used for the synthesis, for the photosynthesis in green plants. Nitrogen cycle involves the fixing of atmospheric nitrogen, which is otherwise unavailable for the living system, but by conversion it into ammonia and nitrites, it is being used by the terrestrial living beings. Then it goes back to atmosphere as inert nitrogen by a process of denitrification. Phosphorus occurs only in the rocks and soil and utilized as phosphate by plants and animals, which finally decompose back to sediments. Then sulfur is transferred to biosphere, then it comes back back to ground, and from ground to atmosphere, and that is how all the biogeochemical cycles play important role in the whole ecosystem. And you must have realized the significance of all these cycles, that until and unless these cycles exist, there won't be a replenishment of the nutrients in the whole ecosystem, which is very, very essential for the sustenance of life overall, for all the biotic as well as abiotic factors, and for the whole ecosystem. So, this is all about biogeochemical cycles. Thank you.